Every small town has its dark secrets, and in the sleepy village of Pine Hollow, it was the Heartwood Forest, dense and untouched. It loomed on the town's outskirts, casting a shadow over the narrow road that wound its way through the woods. For as long as anyone could remember, the forest had been a place of whispered fears, strange sightings, and stories about people who had entered, never to return. Among the locals, it was said that those who entered Heartwood Forest after dark would see things no one else could, things better left unseen. But despite the warnings, Alex, a skeptic and thrill seeker, decided to venture into the forest on Halloween night, determined to prove the town's stories wrong. His friends thought he was crazy, but his curiosity was stronger than any fear. As dusk settled, Alex parked his car at the forest's edge and stepped onto the narrow path, inhaling the earthy, damp scent that clung to the air. The trees were tall and twisted, their branches gnarled like skeletal fingers reaching toward the fading sky. Shadows stretched across the path, deepening with every step as he moved further into the darkness. The deeper he went, the quieter the world became. The sounds of crickets and rustling leaves faded until there was nothing but a strange, echoing silence that pressed down on him. The only sound was his own breathing, which seemed unnaturally loud in the stillness, making him wonder if he was truly alone. Minutes turned into what felt like hours as Alex ventured deeper. He tried to keep track of time, but the forest seemed to warp reality, twisting and bending the path until he felt disoriented. The trees closed in, their bark rough and cold to the touch. He glanced over his shoulder, expecting to see the path he'd just taken, but it had vanished, swallowed by the dark. An eerie feeling crept over him as he continued forward, every sense heightened, every nerve on edge. A faint whispering drifted through the trees, just beyond his line of sight. He paused, straining to listen, but the sound was elusive, always a few steps ahead, urging him to follow. Suddenly, a chill ran down his spine. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He glanced around, but the forest was dense and unyielding. The whispers grew louder, interwoven with strange, echoing laughter that seemed to come from every direction, yet nowhere at all. Trying to shake off the unease, Alex pressed on, clutching his flashlight tightly. Its beam cut through the darkness, illuminating twisted roots and patches of fog that clung to the ground like ghostly tendrils. He told himself it was just his imagination, but his heart raced. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw movement, a flicker of white disappearing between the trees. He stopped, peering into the shadows, but whatever it was had vanished. A cold dread filled him as he realized he couldn't tell where he was. The forest was a maze, every tree and path looking the same, trapping him within its ancient, shadowy embrace. The whispers began again, closer this time, and with them came a faint singing, a lilting, haunting melody that made his skin crawl. It was a song he didn't recognize, yet it stirred something deep within him, a primal fear that told him he needed to get out. And as his pace quickened to a jog, his flashlight flickering as the battery began to wane, panic set in as he stumbled through the underbrush, branches snagging his clothes, slowing him down. The laughter grew louder, cruel and mocking, echoing in the dark. He didn't know what was out there, but he knew it was closing in. Suddenly he tripped, falling hard to the ground. The flashlight slipped from his hand, rolling away as he scrambled to his feet. His breathing was ragged, each gasp echoing in the oppressive silence. He searched for the flashlight, but it had gone dark, leaving him in near total darkness. Then he heard footsteps, soft, deliberate, and approaching slowly from behind. Alex froze, too terrified to turn around, every instinct screaming at him to run. The footsteps stopped mere inches away, and he felt a cold breath on the back of his neck, chilling him to the bone. A voice, barely more than a whisper, spoke from the darkness, each word sending icy chills down his spine. "You shouldn't have come here," it said, a voice both familiar and otherworldly, echoing in his mind. Halloween night descended on the quiet town of Windermere, casting an eerie stillness over its cobbled streets and century-old buildings. Thick fog rolled in, covering the town like a spectral blanket, muffling sounds and hiding shapes in shadows. Most families stayed indoors, watching movies or tending to young trick-or-treaters who dared to brave the cold night. Yet, on the outskirts, just past the old cemetery, a group of friends had gathered with a plan far darker. Emma, Mike, Sarah, and Ben had heard rumors of an abandoned asylum nestled deep in the woods outside Windermere. It was a place whispered about in hushed tones, with stories of inmates who had perished in horrific experiments decades ago. The asylum had been shut down in the 1950s after a series of unexplained deaths, but the building remained, an unyielding structure surrounded by overgrown trees and a rusted iron gate. Local lore claimed that on Halloween night, the spirits of the asylum's patients wandered the grounds. The friends, skeptical yet intrigued, had dared each other to spend the night inside the asylum. They armed themselves with flashlights, cameras, and a sense of bravado they hoped would mask their growing fear. As they ventured into the woods, the fog grew thicker, swallowing the path and shrouding them in near-total darkness. The towering trees seemed to lean in, their branches like skeletal fingers reaching for them, whispering ancient secrets to those who dared enter. After what felt like an eternity, they reached the iron gate of the asylum, its once grand archway now crumbling with decay. A cold wind howled through the rusted bars, carrying a faint, lingering odor that smelled of damp earth and something metallic. Hesitating only for a moment, Emma pushed the gate open, and they stepped inside, the gate slamming shut behind them with a resounding clang that echoed into the night. The asylum loomed before them, an imposing structure of brick and iron, its windows shattered and dark. The once white walls were now stained with grime and mold, giving the building an almost pulsing, diseased look. Vines crept up the walls, twisted and gnarled, as if nature itself had tried to reclaim the place but failed. With a shared look of resolve, the friends made their way to the main entrance, their footsteps crunching on the overgrown gravel path. Inside, the air was thick and stale, carrying the scent of mildew and decay. Dust floated in the beams of their flashlights, swirling in strange patterns as though disturbed by something unseen. The walls were covered in peeling paint, revealing layers of age and neglect, and the floor creaked underfoot as if warning them to turn back. But curiosity propelled them forward, deeper into the asylum's cold, unwelcoming hall. The first room they entered appeared to be an old waiting area. Rows of torn leather chairs lined the walls, and a thick layer of dust covered everything. A rotting wooden desk sat in the corner, a ledger still open to a page filled with names of patients who had checked in, yet with no records of them ever leaving. The friends exchanged uneasy glances, but tried to laugh it off, insisting it was just an old book. As they moved further, they found themselves in a long, narrow hallway, lined with doors that led to the patients' rooms. Most were locked or jammed shut, but occasionally they passed a door that swung open at the slightest touch. Inside, the rooms were bare, save for rusted bed, frames, and shattered windows. They felt a chill run through them, an unspoken understanding that each room held memories too dark to imagine. A sudden sound broke the silence, a faint, shuffling noise coming from the far end of the hallway. Their flashlights flickered, casting dancing shadows on the walls. For a moment, they thought they saw movement, a figure darting across the hall. Mike insisted it was a trick of the light, but the others weren't so sure. Sarah felt her heart pound, a primal sense of dread taking hold. Continuing onward, they found the asylum's infirmary, a room lined with cracked tile and rusted medical equipment. Twisted needles, syringes, and broken bottles littered the floor. In the center of the room was an examination table, its leather straps frayed and stained. Emma's stomach churned as she imagined the horrors that might have taken place there, the screams that had echoed off these walls. The temperature dropped suddenly, and their breath appeared in misty clouds. Then they heard it, a faint whisper too soft to understand, but chilling enough to stop them in their tracks. The whisper grew louder, a chorus of voices overlapping, pleading, crying, laughing in a twisted, hollow tone. It was as if the asylum itself was speaking to them, pulling them deeper into its clutches. They tried to backtrack, but the hallway seemed to twist and turn, leading them back to the same rooms they'd just left. It was as if the asylum was alive, shifting and changing, trapping them within its decayed walls. Panic set in as they realized they couldn't find the way out, their flashlights flickering as the darkness seemed to close in around them. Suddenly, the laughter stopped, replaced by a heavy silence, but then footsteps echoed from down the hall, slow, deliberate, coming closer with each second. They froze, their hearts pounding, as a shadowy figure emerged, its face hidden in darkness, its form twisted and unnatural. It moved slowly, dragging one leg as it advanced, its eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. They ran, stumbling through the labyrinthine halls, but every turn led them back to the figure, as if it were everywhere at once, lurking in every Their breaths came in panicked gasps, their terror mounting with every step, the figure drawing closer, its hand outstretched as if beckoning them to stay. In their frantic escape, they stumbled upon the basement stairs, a narrow, spiraling descent that seemed to lead into complete darkness. With no other choice, they plunged downward, the air growing colder and thicker, the walls closing in as they descended into the depths of the asylum. At the bottom, they found themselves in a large room filled with empty gurneys and shelves lined with glass jars. Inside each jar was something unspeakable, preserved organs, small bones, and things they couldn't identify. The sight was nauseating, and a new wave of horror washed over them as they realized this was no ordinary asylum. Acting it before they could react, the door behind them slammed shut, trapping them. The shadows in the room shifted, and a figure emerged from the darkness, tall and cloaked, with empty sockets where eyes should have been. It reached out, its fingers elongated and twisted, whispering in a voice that seemed to come from the walls themselves. One by one, the friends felt the weight of the asylum bearing down on them, as if it were absorbing their very souls. They tried to scream, but their voices were swallowed by the darkness, leaving only the echo of silence. And as the fog lifted over Windermere, the asylum returned to its stillness, its walls once again empty. The next morning, Windermere awoke to a quiet Halloween dawn, with no trace of the friends who had ventured into the asylum. The townsfolk shook their heads, already preparing new tales to warn the next generation. They knew the asylum would remain, forever cursed, forever hungry. Daniel had driven through endless miles of countryside without seeing another soul. His GPS had stopped working 2 hours ago, leaving him reliant on his memory and the few hand-drawn maps his father had kept in the glove compartment. He was heading to his family's old cabin, deep in the forest where his grandfather used to hunt, and where his father took him as a boy. It was supposed to be a place of refuge, but now it felt more like a destination he was being dragged toward. First, the late afternoon sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the cracked, uneven road. The trees on either side of the road grew closer and denser the further he drove. Gnarled branches reached over the narrow path, forming a dark tunnel of twisted wood. Daniel felt the oppressive weight of their presence, pressing down on him as the sky grew darker. He had taken a wrong turn somewhere, though he couldn't pinpoint where. The road had looked familiar at first, but now it was as if he were driving through a landscape that had never been mapped. Creatures, though familiar in their species, seemed off somehow, too tall, too old. Their bark was blackened and their leaves dull, lacking the vibrancy he remembered from his youth. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the dim light gave way to an eerie twilight, casting everything in a grayish hue. The headlights of his car flickered weakly, barely illuminating the road ahead. Daniel frowned and adjusted dashboard controls, but the lights remained faint, as if the very darkness itself was swallowing the beams. The deeper into the forest he drove, the more the road seemed to twist and narrow. His heart pounded in his chest. There had been no signs for miles, and not even a glimmer of a farmhouse or another car. Just the endless stretch of the road, curving into oblivion. He cursed under his breath, his fingers gripping the wheel tightly. It was then he saw something ahead, barely visible through the dim light and thickening trees, a figure standing by the side of the road. Daniel slowed the car, his mind racing. Who would be out here, in the middle of nowhere at this hour. As he approached, he saw it was an old man, hunched over, leaning on a cane. His clothes were tattered, and his long, scraggly beard was streaked with dirt. His face was pale, nearly white, with hollow eyes that stared blankly ahead. Daniel rolled down his window, feeling a pang of hesitation. "Hey, you need help?" he called out. The old man didn't respond at first, just stood there swaying slightly. Then slowly he turned his head toward Daniel. His lips moved, but no sound came out. It was only then Daniel noticed how gaunt he was. His skin stretched tightly over his bones. The old man's mouth opened again, this time letting out a rasping whisper. Daniel blinked, unsure if he had heard him correctly. "What?" he asked, leaning out of the window slightly. "Turn back," the old man whispered again, his voice barely audible over the sound of the wind in the trees. His eyes, once vacant, now locked onto Daniel's with a desperate intensity. "The road doesn't lead where you think." Chilled, Daniel pulled away, rolling up his window without another word. His hand shook slightly as he gripped the steering wheel. He pressed the gas and drove past the old man, not daring to look back in the rearview mirror. The tree continued winding deeper into the forest, narrower and more twisted with each passing mile. Daniel's heart pounded in his chest. He tried to shake off the encounter, convincing himself the man was just some local eccentric, maybe even drunk. That dear, nagging feeling gnawed at the back of his mind. He checked his phone again. No signal. As night fully descended, the road became barely visible, swallowed by shadows and the oppressive overgrowth of the trees. His car's headlights flickered again, weaker than before. Daniel cursed and tapped the dashboard, but it did little to help. The car felt like it was being swallowed by the darkness. Suddenly, the car jolted and the engine sputtered. Daniel slammed his foot on the brake, bringing the car to a screeching halt. His heart raced as he turned the key in the ignition. The engine coughed but refused to start. "No, no, no," Daniel muttered, hitting the steering wheel in frustration. He sat in the silence for a moment, staring ahead at the dark, empty road. The trees pressed in on all sides, their branches scraping against the car, like fingers scratching to get inside. The forest was unnervingly still, not even the sound of crickets or the rustling of leaves. It was as if the entire world had gone silent. Daniel stepped out of the car, his breath visible in the cool night air. The smell of damp earth and decaying leaves filled his nostrils as he popped the hood and checked the engine. Everything seemed in place, but the engine wouldn't turn over. His pulse quickened as he glanced around. The dense fog had begun to roll in, creeping between the trees and along the road like a living thing. He grabbed his flashlight from the glove compartment and flicked it on. The beam barely cut through the fog, but it was better than nothing. With no cell service and no idea where he was, Daniel knew he had to keep moving. He remembered the old man's words, "Turn back," but it was too late for that now. He set off down the road, flashlight in hand, hoping to find help or at least some sign of where he was. The road seemed endless, winding through the same twisted, blackened trees, each one identical to the last. The fog grew thicker, swallowing the light from his flashlight, making it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. Alaki. After what felt like hours of walking, Daniel stopped. His breath came in short gasps, his legs heavy and aching. But what stopped him wasn't exhaustion, it was the sound. A faint whispering, just at the edge of his hearing, carried by the wind. It was low and constant, like the murmuring of voices just out of reach. He turned in a slow circle, his flashlight scanning the trees. There was no one there, but the whispers persisted, growing louder, closer. Panic gripped him as he realized the voices weren't coming from the forest. They were coming from the road. Daniel's eyes widened as he saw movement ahead, shapes, figures emerging from the fog. At first, they were just shadows, barely distinguishable from the mist. But as they moved closer, he could make them out more clearly. People, dozens of them, walking in silence down the road, their faces pale and expressionless. Some were old, some young, but all of them shared the same hollow, vacant stare. Alaki? Heart pounded in his chest as the figures drew closer, their whispers growing louder until they filled his ears, deafening him. He stumbled backward, tripping over his own feet as he tried to retreat. But the figures kept coming, their mouths moving in a silent chant, their eyes fixed on him. Daniel turned and ran, the flashlight bouncing wildly in his hand as he sprinted down the road. The whispers followed him, growing louder with each. His lungs burned, and his legs felt like lead, but he didn't dare stop. The figures were closing in, their pale faces emerging from the fog, eyes wide and empty. "Alaki?" He glanced over his shoulder and froze. The figures had stopped just a few feet behind him, standing motionless in the middle of the road. But it wasn't their stillness that made his blood run cold. It was their faces. Every one of them was twisted, contorted in silent screams of terror. Without thinking, Daniel sprinted back to his car, his mind racing. When he reached it, the engine started up immediately, as if nothing had happened. He drove off, but no matter how far he went, the road ahead twisted back into itself, leading him right back to the figures, waiting at the same spot, and they were closer. The road stretched on for miles, a thin, cracked line cutting through the desolate landscape. Tall, lifeless trees loomed on either side, their bare branches twisting toward the sky like skeletal fingers. A thick fog had begun to roll in, creeping over the road and swallowing the edges of the forest. Evelyn squinted through the windshield, gripping the steering wheel with white knuckles. It felt like the fog was closing in on her, the mist swirling and thickening until she could barely see beyond the hood of her car. Her GPS had stopped working over an hour ago, leaving her stranded on a road that didn't seem to exist on any map. She had been following what she thought was a shortcut to her grandmother's house, a small detour through the back roads of rural New England. But now she wasn't sure where she was at all. The sun had set hours ago, and the oppressive darkness only added to her growing unease. As she continued driving, Evelyn noticed something in the distance, a faint glow, barely visible through the fog. Relief washed over her. Maybe there was a town up ahead, or at the very least, a gas station where she could stop and ask for directions. She pressed her foot down on the accelerator, her heart beating a little faster with the hope of finding anyone who could help her. As she drew closer, the glow materialized into the faint outline of a building, its lights flickering weakly in the fog. It looked like a small diner, the kind you'd expect to find in a town stuck in time. The neon sign above the entrance buzzed and blinked, barely legible in the thickening mist. It read "Last Stop Diner." Evelyn pulled into the gravel parking lot and turned off the engine. The silence that followed was unnerving. No wind, no sounds of wildlife, just the oppressive quiet of the fog that seemed to suffocate everything around her. She shivered, pulling her jacket tighter as she stepped out of the car. The air was thick and damp, clinging to her skin as she approached. Inside, the diner was surprisingly clean and well kept, though it felt off. A few booths lined the windows, each one empty. The only other person in the room was a man sitting at the counter, his back to her. He was hunched over a cup of coffee, steam rising from the mug in slow, lazy spirals. A jukebox in the corner played soft, distorted music that she couldn't quite place. Evelyn walked up to the counter, trying to ignore the strange sense of dread creeping up her spine. The man didn't look up as she approached, his focus entirely on his cup. "Excuse me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you know where I am? I think I'm lost." The man didn't respond. He just sat there, motionless, staring into his coffee as if it held the answers to all of life's questions. Evelyn frowned, her discomfort growing. She glanced around the diner, but there was no sign of a waitress or anyone else who might work there. "Hey," she tried again, louder this time. "I need directions." Still nothing. The man's stillness was unnerving, and something about the way he sat there, so rigid, so utterly motionless, made her stomach churn. She took a step back, her instinct telling her to leave, but then a door behind the counter swung open. A woman stepped out, wearing a stained apron and a weary smile. Her eyes were tired, dark circles marring the pale skin beneath them. "Sorry about him," the waitress said, nodding toward the man at the counter. "He doesn't talk much." Evelyn forced a smile, though the unease gnawed at her. "I just need some directions. My GPS stopped working, and I'm not sure where I am." The waitress wiped her hands on her apron, her smile never quite reaching her eyes. People don't usually come through here anymore? That's an understatement, Evelyn muttered under her breath. She glanced back at the man, who still hadn't moved. Can you tell me how to get to Route 17? I think I took a wrong turn somewhere. The waitress's smile faltered for just a moment, her eyes flicking to the man at the counter before returning to Evelyn. Sure thing, she said, her voice a little too cheerful. Just keep driving straight. You'll find your way soon enough. Evelyn nodded, though something in the waitress's tone sent a chill through her. She thanked her quickly and turned to leave, eager to be back in her car and away from the diner's strange atmosphere. But as she reached for the door, the man at the counter finally moved. Don't go, he said, his voice low and hoarse. Evelyn froze, her hand hovering just above the door handle. You don't want to leave. Sunken and hollow, bored into her with an intensity that made her stomach drop. What? She stammered, unsure if she had heard him correctly. Don't go, he repeated, his voice strained, as if each word was a monumental effort. The road? It's not safe. The waitress stepped forward, her smile returning, but it was wrong. Too wide, too forced. Don't mind him, she said, her tone bright and cheerful. He's been here too long. Lost his mind, poor thing. Evelyn swallowed hard, her pulse quickening. Every instinct screamed at her to leave, but the man's eyes were pleading. Desperate. What do you mean? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The man's gaze shifted toward the windows, where the fog pressed against the glass like a living thing. The road? He rasped. It doesn't end. It just keeps going. A cold dread settled in Evelyn's chest. She glanced at the waitress, who was watching her with an unsettling intensity, her smile still plastered to her face. I think I'll be fine, Evelyn muttered, turning back toward the door. She yanked it open and stepped out into the... As she hurried to her car, the man's words echoed in her mind. The road doesn't end. She shook her head, trying to push the thought away. He was crazy. Delusional? Just another lonely soul trapped in a forgotten town. She started the engine, casting one last glance at the diner. Through the fog, she could see the waitress standing in the doorway, watching her with that eerie smile. And behind her, the man sat at the counter. Evelyn tore her gaze away and sped out of the parking lot. The fog seemed to close in around her, the thick, white mist swallowing the road as her headlights cut through it. The farther she drove, the heavier the fog became, wrapping around her car like a shroud. Minutes passed, then hours, but the road never changed. It just stretched on and on, twisting through the same barren landscape. Panic began to creep in as Evelyn glanced at the clock on her dashboard. It hadn't moved. The hands were frozen, stuck in place at the same time. She had arrived at the diner. Her breath quickened, her fingers gripping the wheel so tightly that her knuckles turned white. This wasn't right. She pressed harder on the gas, the speedometer climbing as the car raced down the seemingly endless road. But no matter how fast she went, the fog never thinned, and the landscape never changed. The same lifeless trees, the same cracked asphalt, the same suffocating silence. And then, out of the fog, she saw it. The diner. Her heart stopped. It was the exact same diner. The same neon sign flickering weakly in the mist. No, she whispered, her voice trembling. She slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a halt in the middle of the road. How was this possible? She had been driving for hours. Trembling, Evelyn stared at the diner in disbelief. The same gravel lot, the same rusted sign. It was like she had never left. Her breathing came in shallow, ragged gasps as she tried to make sense of it. But there was no logic to this. During no explanation, she was trapped. Her pulse thundered in her ears as she turned the car around, speeding off in the opposite direction. But the road stretched on endlessly, the fog pressing in tighter, suffocating her. Minutes passed, then hours, and when she rounded the next bend, her heart sank. The diner was there again. This time, the lights were off and the windows were dark. The neon sign hung crookedly from the roof, buzzing faintly in the mist. The night of Halloween in the small town of Hollowbrook, draped in an unsettling silence that settled over every house, every street. In the quiet neighborhood of Mulberry Lane, a single house stood out, A once charming Victorian with ivy-covered walls and a garden that had long been overrun by weeds, the townsfolk avoided this house, especially on Halloween, for tales of strange happenings and whispered rumors plagued its history. The house had been vacant for decades, its windows dark and hollow, as if watching over the town with a silent. But this Halloween, lights flickered on inside, casting an eerie glow through the grimy windows. The townsfolk watched from afar, uneasy murmurs passing through the crowd as they wondered who had dared enter the old Hollowbrook house. 4 teenagers, fueled by the thrill of Halloween and a morbid curiosity, had dared each other to explore the house. They were drawn to its forbidden allure, oblivious to the warnings and stories passed down through generations. Armed with flashlights and a bravado that masked their fear, they approached the front door, their shadows merging with the house's dark presence. The door creaked open with an unnatural ease, as though it had been waiting for them, welcoming them into its decaying embrace. Inside, the air was thick and damp, tinged with the scent of mildew and something else, something metallic, something rotten. The teenagers shivered as they crossed the threshold, feeling the weight of the house settle upon them like a heavy shroud. The hallway stretched before them, narrow and suffocating, lined with portraits of people whose eyes seemed to follow their every step. The portraits were old, their faces painted in an eerie detail, each expression frozen in an unsettling half-smile that seemed to shift when looked at too long. The silence was thick, broken only by the muffled footsteps that echoed through the house. As they ventured deeper, the floorboards creaked underfoot, each groan of wood reverberating through the empty rooms. Seeing their flashlights cast narrow beams of light, illuminating dust particles that floated in the stale air. Shadows danced along the walls, twisting and contorting, taking on shapes that seemed almost human. In the dining room, a long table stretched out, covered in a faded lace tablecloth, its surface littered with antique silverware and plates that hadn't been touched in decades. The silver was tarnished, and the plates held the remnants of some long. A half-empty wine glass sat at the table's head, its contents a dark, crimson liquid that glistened in the flashlight's beam. A shiver ran down their spines as one of them whispered that it looked like blood. Silence fell again, heavy and oppressive, as the air grew colder, as if the house itself was reacting to their presence. They tried to laugh it off, but the tension in the air was palpable, pressing down on them with an invisible weight. The teenagers moved through the rooms, each one more decrepit than the last. In the parlor, an old piano sat in the corner, its keys yellowed with age. Dust covered its surface, but the bench was strangely clear, as if someone had recently sat. They lingered, staring at the piano, half expecting it to play on its own, to shatter the silence with a chilling melody. They continued upstairs, their footsteps echoing through the hollow corridors. At the top of the stairs, a long hallway stretched before them, lined with closed doors, each one slightly ajar, as if inviting them in. The wallpaper was peeling, revealing faded floral patterns beneath, and the air was thick with the scent of decay. At the end of the hallway, a door stood out, a thick wooden door that seemed untouched by time, its surface dark and polished. The teenagers felt drawn to it, their curiosity overpowering their fear. They approached, feeling the tension in the air mount, as if the house itself was holding its breath. With a trembling hand, one of them reached for the door, pushing it open slowly. The hinges creaked, breaking the silence, and they stepped into the room beyond. It was a bedroom, furnished in the style of a bygone era, with a 4-poster bed draped in dusty curtains, and a vanity adorned with cracked glass bottles and a tarnished mirror. In the mirror, they saw their reflections pale and ghostly, their faces distorted by the glass. But behind them something else moved, an indistinct shadow that lurked just out of sight, shifting in the dim light. They spun around, but the room was empty, the shadows still and silent. The air grew colder, and the walls seemed to close in, pressing them into the center of the room. The door behind them swung shut with a loud bang, trapping them inside. Panic set in as they banged on the door, their voices echoing in the confined space, swallowed by the silence that filled the house. They turned, hearts pounding, as they heard a faint whispering. It was a low, guttural sound, like a voice that hadn't spoken in centuries. The whisper grew louder, filling the room until they could make out the words. It was an incantation, a dark chant that echoed through their minds, leaving them paralyzed with fear. The shadows in the room began to shift, taking shape, forming figures that moved toward them with slow, deliberate steps. The figures were cloaked in darkness, their faces hidden, but their eyes gleamed with a malevolent light that sent chills down their spines. The teenagers tried to back away, but there was nowhere to go. The figures closed in, their voices merging into a haunting chant that reverberated through the walls, filling the room with an unbearable sense of dread. The shadows reached out, their hands cold and skeletal, grasping at the teenagers with an unrelenting grip. One by one, they felt the darkness seep into their skin, cold and suffocating, as if the house itself was consuming them, pulling them into its depths. Their screams echoed through the empty rooms, but outside, the night remained silent, indifferent to their terror. The next morning, the townsfolk found the house dark and empty, its windows as hollow and lifeless as they had always been. There was no sign of the teenagers, no trace of their presence, as if they had simply vanished into thin air. Over the years, others would enter the house drawn by the same allure, compelled to uncover its secrets, but each one would meet the same fate, disappearing without a trace, leaving behind only whispers of their terror. And on Halloween night, the house would come alive once more, its windows glowing with an eerie light, casting shadows that danced in the darkness. The townsfolk would watch from afar, knowing better than to approach, for they understood that the house was a living entity, a hungry spirit that fed on the souls of those foolish enough to enter. The house remained, a silent sentinel watching over Hollow Brook, its dark presence a constant reminder of the horror that lurked within. As the house settled into silence once more, the townsfolk avoided it with even greater conviction, whispers of its curse spreading. For years, it remained untouched, looming over Hollow Brook with a silent menace. But curiosity has a way of creeping in, and on another Halloween, 5 brave souls from a nearby town dared to test its limits. Drawn by stories of vanished teens and haunted rooms, they sought thrills, unaware they would become part of the legend themselves. The group arrived at dusk, marveling at the house's decayed beauty, the ivy twisting up its walls like a lover's embrace. Laughing nervously, they crossed the overgrown lawn, feeling an odd stillness settle over them. When they reached the door, it swung open before they could touch it. No one mentioned the chill that swept through, only exchanged uneasy glances before stepping inside. Inside, the air was thick, almost suffocating. The wallpaper seemed to have aged further, now peeling off in wet, curling strips. Shadows stretched oddly long in the dim light of their flashlights, shifting with each step as if aware of the intruders. The house felt almost alive, its heartbeat a faint, pulsing hum they could barely perceive. They moved from room to room, each filled with the stale scent of decay and dust, and the oppressive weight of silence. The floorboards groaned beneath them as if protesting their presence. In the parlor, an old record player sat silent, a thin layer of dust coating its needle. But as they passed, it clicked on with a crackling hum, playing a low, distorted waltz that echoed eerily. The group exchanged nervous glances, but brushed it off, moving to the grand staircase that spiraled upward. As they climbed, they felt a palpable shift, the air growing colder with each step. When they reached the landing, they noticed the portraits on the wall, faces they didn't recognize, all staring down at them with hollow, knowing eyes. In the upstairs hall, the doors stood slightly ajar, their dark interiors hinting at secrets hidden within. The group huddled closer, their whispers dying on their lips as the house's oppressive silence seemed to swallow even the faintest sound. The long hallway beckoned them forward, as if guiding them deeper into its clutches. One of them noticed a faint light spilling out from the door at the end of the hall. They moved toward it, compelled by an invisible force, and pushed open the door. Inside, a dimly lit room revealed itself, the walls adorned with cracked, yellowed mirrors, all reflecting warped images of the room and themselves. As they stood in the room, the mirrors flickered, their reflections distorting and twisting. The light grew dimmer, casting long, sinister shadows that moved independently of them. One by one, the mirrors began to crack, spiderwebbing with fractures, each shattering with a deafening sound that seemed to echo through the house. Fear surged as they realized the door had closed behind them. Panic set in, and they began to pound on it, their voices rising in terrified pleas, but the door wouldn't budge. Then, the room's temperature plummeted, their breath visible as they huddled together, listening to a low, guttural whisper filling the air. The whisper turned into a chant, the words foreign and dark, resonating in their bones. Shadows gathered in the corners of the room, taking on ghostly forms that loomed closer. The figures in the mirrors stared at them with empty eyes, their faces slowly splitting into twisted, sinister grins that seemed to mock the trap. Desperation filled the group as they clawed at the door, the mirrors continuing to splinter, each piece reflecting a fractured image of terror. A figure stepped forward from the shadows, a tall, faceless being cloaked in darkness, radiating an aura of malevolence that sent chills through their very souls. The house seemed to draw strength from their fear, its walls pulsating as if it were breathing them in, claiming them as its own. One by one, their screams faded, absorbed into the darkness that pressed around them, leaving only silence behind. May morning, the house sat undisturbed once more, its doors shut tight and windows dark. The townsfolk noticed that 5 more souls had vanished, but no one dared investigate. The legends grew, warning others to stay away from Hollowbrook House on Halloween night. As years passed, the house continued to watch over the town, growing stronger with each passing Halloween. And every so often, if one looked closely enough, they might see a flicker of light in the windows, a faint echo of the lost souls forever trapped within the shadows of the house. By morning, Hollowbrook House stood silent, doors shut and windows lifeless, concealing all traces of the 5 who had dared enter. It was supposed to be a simple road trip, just a couple of friends, taking the back roads to avoid the hustle and bustle of the interstate, heading toward a cabin they had rented for the weekend. Dylan, Lisa, Aaron, and Rachel had been friends since college, and these yearly getaways were a tradition. The plan was to leave early in the morning, take the scenic route through the mountains, and arrive at the cabin by dusk. But as they wound deeper into the forest, far from any signs of civilization, their GPS began acting up. Lost signal again. Lisa asked from the passenger seat, glancing at Dylan, who was driving. He sighed and tapped the screen of his phone, but it was no use. "Yeah, it's been dead for the last 15 minutes. Guess we're doing this the old-fashioned way," Dylan muttered, gripping the wheel tightly. His knuckles whitened as the sun began to sink lower in the sky, casting long shadows over the narrow road. The trees crowded the car from both sides, towering so high that the sky was barely visible through the canopy of branches. Aaron, sitting in the back with Rachel, leaned forward. "We should have stayed on the main road," he said, half joking, but there was a trace of unease in his voice. "It's fine," Dylan replied, though he didn't sound entirely convinced. "We'll hit a town soon. There's gotta be something up ahead." They drove on in silence for a while longer, the road stretching endlessly in front of them. No signs, no other cars, not even a mailbox to suggest there were homes nearby. The silence was unsettling, broken only by the hum of the engine and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. As they rounded a bend, they saw it, a small gas station, the only structure for miles. It looked old, almost out of place, with peeling paint and a rusty sign that swayed gently in the breeze. A single pump stood out front, its numbers faded and weathered. Dylan slowed the car, relief washing over him. "Finally," Rachel muttered from the back seat. "I've been holding my pee for hours." Dylan pulled into the gravel lot and parked next to the pump. The place looked deserted, but the lights inside were on, casting a sickly yellow glow. "Let's stretch our legs," Dylan said, stepping out of the car. The others followed, grateful for the break. As Lisa made her way toward the restroom around the side of the building, Aaron and Rachel wandered inside the small convenience store attached to the station. Dylan started filling the tank, his eyes scanning the surrounding forest. There was something off about the place. The trees stood unnaturally still, and the air was thick, almost suffocating. Inside, the store was eerily quiet. Rows of shelves held dusty cans and faded boxes of food, the kind that looked like they had been sitting there for decades. Aaron and Rachel exchanged uneasy glances as they approached the counter. There was no sign of an attendant, though the cash register was open and a small bell sat on the counter. Rachel reached out and rang the bell. The sound echoed through the empty store, but no one came. "Maybe they're in the back?" Aaron suggested, though he sounded uncertain. Meanwhile, Lisa emerged from the restroom, wiping her hands on her jeans. She paused, frowning at the car. Something wasn't right. Dylan was still standing at the pump, staring intently into the woods. "Dylan," she called out, but he didn't respond. She walked over, concern growing in her chest. "What's up?" she asked, touching his arm. Dylan jumped, startled, as if he hadn't noticed her approach. His eyes were wide, unfocused. I thought I saw something," he murmured, glancing back at the tree line. "Something was watching us. Alaki." Lisa followed his gaze, but all she saw were the dense trees, their branches swaying gently in the wind. "It's probably just your imagination," she said, though her own unease was growing. "Come on, let's finish up and get going." Inside the store, Aaron rang the bell again, harder this time. The sharp ding echoed, but still, no one came. "This is weird," Rachel whispered, her voice low. The store felt wrong, like a place forgotten by time. The air was stale, and the dim fluorescent lights flickered overhead. "I don't like this," Aaron muttered, backing away from the counter. "Let's just pay and go." They left a few crumpled bills on the counter and quickly made their way back to the car. Dylan had finished filling the tank, but he was still watching the woods, his eyes darting nervously. "Let's go," Rachel said, climbing into the back seat. "This place gives me the creeps." As soon as they were all inside, Dylan pulled out of the lot, his foot pressing hard on the gas. The car sped down the road, leaving the gas station in the rearview mirror, but the unease followed them, clinging to the air like a thick fog. No one spoke for a long time, the silence inside the car almost unbearable. Then from the back seat, Aaron broke the quiet. "Did you guys notice the clock in there? Halaki." Dylan glanced at him in the rearview mirror. "What about it?" "It wasn't moving," Aaron said, his voice barely above a whisper. The second hand, it was stuck, just ticking in place, over and over. Lisa shivered. "Maybe it was broken." "Maybe?" Aaron muttered, though he didn't sound convinced. The road stretched on, winding deeper into the woods. The sun had set now, and the darkness was suffocating. Their headlights barely penetrated the dense forest, and the trees seemed to close in around them, pressing against the sides of the car. "We should have reached the cabin by now," Lisa murmured, checking her phone again. No signal. She looked out the window, but all she saw was endless blackness, broken only by the occasional flicker of movement among the trees. She wasn't sure if it was her imagination or something else, but she couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed. Then, without warning, the car's engine sputtered. Dylan cursed under his breath, gripping the steering wheel tighter as the car began to slow. The headlights flickered, and the dashboard lights blinked out. No, Dylan muttered, desperately trying to restart the engine, but it was no use. The car rolled to a stop on the side of the road, its engine dead. "Great," Rachel said, her voice tinged with panic. "What now?" Dylan rubbed his hands over his face. "I don't know. We can't be that far from the cabin. Maybe we walk?" Aaron shook his head. "In the dark? No way. We should stay here until morning. We've got supplies, right?" Lisa bit her lip, glancing out the window. The woods seemed darker than ever. and that unsettling feeling of being watched hadn't left her. "I don't know if we should stay here." Suddenly, a sound echoed through the trees. It was faint at first, a soft rustling, but then it grew louder, closer. It wasn't the wind. Something was moving through the woods, something large. The group fell silent, their breath caught in their throat. What? What is that?" Rachel whispered, her voice barely audible. The rustling grew louder, and then a low growl cut through the night, sending chills down their spines. Dylan's eyes widened, and without thinking, he reached for the keys, trying the ignition again. The engine sputtered, then roared to life. Relief washed over them, but it was short-lived. And from the trees, a figure emerged, tall, emaciated, with glowing eyes that reflected the car's headlights. It stood at the edge of the road, its limbs unnaturally long, its skin stretched tight over its bones. For a moment, it just watched them, its eyes gleaming in the dark. "Go," Aaron shouted. Dylan didn't need to be told twice. He slammed his foot on the gas, the car lurching forward. The figure darted back into the trees, but they could feel its presence, lurking just beyond the light. The road twisted and turned, but no matter how fast they went, the figure seemed to keep pace, always just out of sight. The fear in the car was palpable, thick as the darkness outside. No one spoke, their eyes fixed on the road ahead, hearts pounding in their chests. And then, as they rounded a bend, the headlights illuminated something that made their blood run cold. The gas station, the same one they had just left, sitting there at the side of the road, untouched and unchanged. We didn't turn around, did we?" Lisa asked, her voice trembling. Dylan's hands tightened on the wheel, his knuckles white. "No," he whispered. "No, we didn't." But there it was, the same gas station, the same rusty pump, the same flickering lights. Every small town has its dark secrets, and in the sleepy village of Pine Hollow, it was the Heartwood Forest, dense and untouched. It loomed on the town's outskirts, casting a shadow over the narrow road that wound its way through the woods. For as long as anyone could remember, the forest had been a place of whispered fears, strange sightings, and stories about people who had entered, never to return. Among the locals, it was said that those who entered Heartwood Forest after dark would see things no one else could, things better left unseen. But despite the warnings, Alex, a skeptic and thrill seeker, decided to venture into the forest on Halloween night, determined to prove the town's stories wrong. His friends thought he was crazy, but his curiosity was stronger than any fear. As dusk settled, Alex parked his car at the forest's edge and stepped onto the narrow path, inhaling the earthy, damp scent that clung to the air. The trees were tall and twisted, their branches gnarled like skeletal fingers reaching toward the fading sky. Shadows stretched across the path, deepening with every step as he moved further into the darkness. The deeper he went, the quieter the world became. The sounds of crickets and rustling leaves faded until there was nothing but a strange, echoing silence that pressed down on him. The only sound was his own breathing, which seemed unnaturally loud in the stillness, making him wonder if he was truly alone. Minutes turned into what felt like hours as Alex ventured deeper. He tried to keep track of time, but the forest seemed to warp reality, twisting and bending the path until he felt disoriented. The trees closed in, their bark rough and cold to the touch. He glanced over his shoulder, expecting to see the path he'd just taken, but it had vanished, swallowed by the dark. An eerie feeling crept over him as he continued forward, every sense heightened, every nerve on edge. A faint whispering drifted through the trees, just beyond his line of sight. He paused, straining to listen, but the sound was elusive, always a few steps ahead, urging him to follow. Suddenly, a chill ran down his spine. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He glanced around, but the forest was dense and unyielding, revealing. The whispers grew louder, interwoven with strange, echoing laughter that seemed to come from every direction, yet nowhere at all. Trying to shake off the unease, Alex pressed on, clutching his flashlight tightly. Its beam cut through the darkness, illuminating twisted roots and patches of fog that clung to the ground like ghostly tendrils. He told himself it was just his imagination, but his heart... Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw movement, a flicker of white disappearing between the trees. He stopped, peering into the shadows, but whatever it was had vanished. A cold dread filled him as he realized he couldn't tell where he was anymore. The forest was a maze, every tree and path looking the same, trapping him within its ancient, shadowy embrace. The whispers began again, closer this time, and with them came a faint singing, a lilting, haunting melody that made his skin crawl. It was a song he didn't recognize, yet it stirred something deep within him, a primal fear that told him he needed to get out. And as his pace quickened to a jog, his flashlight flickering as the battery began to wane, panic set in as he stumbled through the underbrush, branches snagging his clothes, slowing him down. The laughter grew louder, cruel and mocking, echoing in the dark. He didn't know what was out there, but he knew it was closing in. Suddenly he tripped, falling hard to the ground. The flashlight slipped from his hand, rolling away as he scrambled to his feet. His breathing was ragged, each gasp echoing in the oppressive silence. He searched for the flashlight, but it had gone dark, leaving him in near total darkness. Just then, he heard footsteps, soft, deliberate, and approaching slowly from behind. Alex froze, too terrified to turn around, every instinct screaming at him to run. The footsteps stopped mere inches away, and he felt a cold breath on the back of his neck, chilling him to the bone. A voice, barely more than a whisper, spoke from the darkness, each word sending icy chills down his spine. "You shouldn't have come here," it said, a voice both familiar and otherworldly, echoing in his mind, as if it had come from within him.